My eyes were locked on the flickering candle flames atop the simple cake I'd bought from the market. 25 years. A quarter-century of my life had passed, and here I was, celebrating this birthday alone. The silence around my kitchen table was so thick it almost carried a tangible weight. The city lights filtering through the thin curtains of my apartment cast dull reflections on the walls. My phone screen lit up once again. A familiar number. That number silent for 7 years. My fingers hesitated, pulling back before they could dare to touch it. An instinct told me this call wouldn't bring me peace. But there it was. Mom and Dad. 7 years. Not a single text, not a single birthday remembered in all that time. So what had changed now? When the phone vibrated and clattered against the table, an old fear stirred inside me. Years ago, the sound of footsteps echoing through the house, doors slamming, Rachel's angry screams. Then that crushing silence. The cruelest form of being ignored as a child. The phone went quiet, and a few seconds later it rang again. I let out a breath, deep and shaky. My hands were sweating. I picked up the phone and slid my finger across the screen. Hello? My voice was a whisper, foreign even to my own ears. A brief pause, then a familiar voice. Alexandra. My father's voice carried the weight of years, yet still held that familiar, distant tone. Happy birthday. Forced politeness. Fake warmth. Thanks. The word dropped from my mouth like a cold stone into the air. Then my mother's voice joined in. Softer, even more artificial. Oh, sweetie, we've missed you so much. Missed me? I rolled my eyes. Had I not crossed their minds even once in 7 years? I gripped the phone tighter. Why are you calling? Silence. Now that was familiar. The silence of my childhood. My father cleared his throat. There's an issue with your sister. Something inside me twisted, cold and sharp. Of course. Rachel. Always Rachel. My father's voice rang in my ears like a trembling echo. There's an issue with your sister. The words hung in the air, lodging in my throat. I listened to the silence. I could imagine my parents on the other end, exchanging glances, debating how to proceed. In the past, this silence would have unsettled me. As a child, there were moments like this at home, when Rachel had a meltdown and my parents, busy trying to calm her, forgot I even existed. I was always left in the shadow of the room. But I wasn't a shadow anymore. And the silence no longer had power over me. Did something happen to Rachel? I asked. My voice was surprisingly steady. Oh, honey, my mother said. It's a little hard to talk about this over the phone, but Rachel's going through a really tough time right now. She needs your support. Those 3 words, I'd heard them 1,000 times before. She needs your support. As a kid, I had to walk on eggshells because of Rachel's mood swings. When I retreated to my room, I'd hear the arguments rising beyond my door. Then a crash. Sometimes it was plates, sometimes toys, sometimes just my mother's breathless scream. And the next day, everything would carry on as if it were normal. Like bruises that went ignored. How do you expect me to support her? I asked, my nails scraping the edge of the table. You haven't called me in 7 years. You never asked how I was doing. And now, out of the blue, I hear from you and I'm supposed to guess what's going on. My father took a deep breath. Alexandra, please don't be dramatic. Dramatic? I closed my eyes, anger swelling inside me. My mother jumped in quickly. Sweetie, we've always thought about you. But Rachel's situation. She's always been a little more fragile, you know? Dealing with her was so hard that sometimes we didn't have the chance to figure out how you felt. There it was, the sentence I knew so well. Rachel was always fragile. Rachel always needed understanding. But me? I was simply overlooked. My feelings, my needs, the words I spoke without screaming, they went unheard. What did Rachel do? I said bluntly. Another silence. Finally, my father cleared his throat and spoke. There's a lawsuit. We need a lawyer to help her. I waited. Was that all the explanation I'd get? Why is there a lawsuit? I asked, trying to keep the patience in my voice. My mother cut in immediately, words tumbling out of her mouth. It's not a big deal. People just don't understand, Rachel. They never have, you know that. There was a misunderstanding at work. A misunderstanding. I'd heard that word before. When we were kids and Rachel slapped me or pulled my hair, they'd say, "You misunderstood, she didn't mean it like that." In my teenage years, when Rachel had a breakdown and trashed my room, they'd say, "Don't make a big deal out of it, you misunderstood." And now, here it was again. "How much money do you need?" I said in a flat tone. My father paused for a moment. Then, without much thought, he said, $50,000. I closed my eyes. This was confirmation of everything I'd known. They hadn't called because they needed me, they called because they needed something from me. After 7 years of silence, they expected me to step back in and shoulder Rachel's problems. A knot formed in my stomach. My free hand clenched into a fist on the table. Then my lips moved slowly and the words spilled out. No. And the silence on the phone, for the first time in my life, truly belonged to me. The word hung in the air. No. It was that simple. A single syllable, a single refusal. But it echoed within me like a keystone, lifting the weight of years off my shoulders. There was silence on the other end of the phone. I could hear my mother's short, uneven breaths. My father had a habit of clearing his throat, but this time he didn't cough. For the first time, I could sense their shock. "Alexandra," my father said finally. His voice was harder now. "This is a family matter." I laughed inwardly, but instead of a chuckle, only a bitter breath escaped me. When has this family matter ever been about me? I haven't even spoken to you in years. My mother jumped in. "But we've always thought about you, sweetie. It's just we had to focus on Rachel. She needed support. You were strong, Alexandra. You've always been strong." Strong, was I? Was I strong when I locked myself in my room as a child, screaming silently into my pillow? Was I strong when not once, not a single day, did they ask, "Are you okay, Alexandra?" Was I strong when they told me, "She's going through a tough time," as Rachel belittled me, pushed me around? I took a deep breath, trying to slow the pounding of my heart. "I see," I said at last. "So because I was strong, you forgot about me? Because I was strong, you stood by Rachel but never by me?" My mother fell silent. I knew it. 'Cause she knew the answer too. "I know why you really called me," I went on. "You need money. Rachel's in trouble and once again you expect me to fix it." My father's voice sharpened. "Look, Alexandra, now isn't the time to argue about this. We just... Not the time." I cut in, not bothering to hide the icy edge in my tone. "It wasn't the time when I left home at 18 with nowhere to belong, was it? It wasn't the time when you forgot I existed while calming Rachel's every tantrum, was it? And now, 7 years later, it's suddenly the time to talk because Rachel needs something?" My mother mumbled something, but the words tangled into a mess. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. Could I hear them again? Yes. Did I need to? No. For a second, my finger hovered over the screen. And then I hung up. They'd given me silence for years. Now, for the first time, I gave it back to them. I took a deep breath as I set the phone down on the table. My heart was still racing. My hands trembled slightly, as if my body was trying to shake off a fight mode it had been trapped in for years. I stood up and headed to the kitchen. Standing at my small sink, I turned on the cold water. As I washed my hands, the same question kept circling in my mind. Was it really this easy? To refuse them, to say no. No. You can't just show up out of nowhere when you need me. No. I'm not your burden anymore. No. I've built my own life and I'm not going back. The water slipped through my fingers and echoes of the past flooded my mind. Rachel's tantrums, my mother's silence, my father's harsh but distant voice. Then something shifted inside me. I realized silence wasn't my enemy. Silence was my freedom. I turned around and walked to my living room. The phone was still on the table, but I wasn't looking at it anymore. I gazed out the window, the city lights flickering against the glass. This was my world. My space. And in this world there was no Rachel. No mom. No dad. Just me. And for the first time, that didn't feel bad. As I looked out of my living room window, I watched the city lights flicker against the glass. The streets were filled with the glow of car headlights and the shadows of a crowd nearing midnight. People passed by one another, some talking, some walking alone. I was alone too. But for the first time, that loneliness didn't feel suffocating. It wasn't like the loneliness I'd felt years ago, escaping Rachel's angry screams. Nor was it like the invisibility I'd experienced in those moments when my parents' eyes shifted from me to Rachel. This loneliness belonged to me. It was my choice. I listened to the silence of my living room, the distant hum of the city, the echo of footsteps on the street. But here, in this small apartment, it was just me. I turned to the cake on the table. A small, ordinary celebration cake. The flames of the candles had melted, blending into the frosting. I hadn't even had the chance to blow them out because of the phone call. For a moment, I wondered, did blowing out those candles really matter? Then I extinguished them with my fingers. The flames flickered for a second before vanishing. For years, birthdays had meant nothing to me. Rachel's birthdays came with special parties planned just for her. She'd get her favorite gifts, the best cakes prepared in her honor. My birthdays, though, sometimes they were remembered, sometimes they weren't. Even when they were, the celebrations depended on Rachel's mood. If she was having a good day, we might have a normal dinner. But if it was a bad day, the whole thing would spiral into chaos. Today, with this little cake, I was savoring my own solitude. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to overlook me on my birthday. Because I didn't need anyone. I whispered to myself, "Happy birthday, Alexandra." And I picked up a fork, taking a bite of the cake. It was surprisingly good. As the night wore on, I felt lighter. What would happen after this conversation? Would my parents give up? Or would they call again? I didn't know. But that uncertainty didn't scare me. I grabbed a cup of tea and sat by the window. I put my phone on silent and left it on the table. For the first time, I felt the peace of knowing their voices couldn't reach me. And then my door rang. I looked up. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. And something inside me cut like a knife. Rachel. She was there. Her face was as cold and expressionless as ever, but there was that familiar darkness in her eyes. After 7 years, I was seeing her for the first time. My heart raced. I stood at the door for a moment, and inside me, that old fear I'd kept buried for years began to stir. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Rachel. How had she found me here? More importantly, why had she come? I knew my parents wouldn't give up that easily, but Rachel showing up at my door in person, this was different. I tried to study my breathing. My heart raced under the weight of memories. Rachel's angry face, her condescending glares, the time she locked me in rooms as a child, the blame she threw at me. Every bad moment of my childhood tightened inside me like a trembling string. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Rachel stood at the threshold, lingering slightly back as if she knew the door might slam shut any second. She was still as beautiful as ever, she always had been. Her hair was flawless, her clothes expensive and stylish. But there were lines of exhaustion under her eyes. For a moment our eyes met. She spoke first. "I didn't think you'd open the door." I shrugged. "I didn't think I had to, but here you are." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "Mom and Dad called you, didn't they?" "They did. From what I heard, you said no." A strange sense of satisfaction rose within me. Rachel wasn't used to this. She always got what she wanted. But not this time. "I can make my own decisions, Rachel," I said calmly. In that moment, I noticed something. This wasn't the usual arrogant Rachel. Today she looked diminished. The darkness in her eyes was more pronounced, her lips slightly chapped. "What happened to you?" I asked. Rachel let out a laugh, but it held neither joy nor mockery. She looked at me, then took a step toward the floor, shoving her hands into her pockets. "I need to talk to you, Alex." I sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "Are we going to talk about the $50,000 Mom and Dad want from me? Or is this something else?" Rachel's face tightened. Her hands clenched into fists, then relaxed again. "Are you going to let me in, or are we just going to stand here?" Let her in? Into my home? My space? My mind flashed back to years ago, how she'd locked me in my room, pulled my hair, taken out her bad days on me just because she could. But something was different. Rachel didn't seem as powerful as she once did. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of what she might do. I opened the door wider and stepped back. "You've got 5 minutes." Rachel nodded and stepped inside. As I closed the door, a strange feeling settled in me. Rachel was here in my apartment, but this time it felt like I held the power. And that was a feeling I'd never known before. Rachel scanned my living room. She took in everything, the small but tidy kitchen, the bookshelves, the plants I'd placed by the window. Then her gaze landed on the cake on the kitchen table. The extinguished candles, the slightly smeared frosting. Her brows furrowed slightly. "Was it your birthday?" she asked. "It was," I said. "I guess it's over now." Rachel fell silent for a moment. Then she sighed and pulled out a chair to sit down. She clasped her hands on the table. "Mom and Dad didn't tell you the truth," she said finally. I waited. Rachel lifted her eyes to mine. That usual confident, condescending look was gone. Instead, she seemed oddly nervous. I made a big mistake." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of mistake?" Rachel bit her lip, as if she didn't know how to say it. Then she spoke slowly. "At work, they trusted me with some financial transactions. But I messed up, and now there's a lawsuit against me. It's not just about losing my job, Alex. It's serious. There could be a fine, maybe even jail time." I heard the tremor in her voice. This was real fear. Seeing Rachel afraid, it was unsettling. I'd always known her as strong, always in control. But now, here she was. A collapse in her eyes, a faint tremble in her hands. "That's why Mom and Dad called me," I said slowly. "They wanted money for you." Rachel nodded. "Yes, but they're not handling it the way I'd want them to. They think money can fix everything. But her voice trailed off. She ran her hands through her hair. I don't know if I deserve this, Alex. And in that moment, everything shifted. This was the first time Rachel had ever confessed anything to me. As far as I'd known her, she didn't make mistakes. She didn't take blame. She didn't apologize. But right now, the Rachel sitting across from me was doubting herself. The Rachel who had belittled me, tormented me for years, now looked broken. I didn't know what this meant. But one thing I did know. This Rachel wasn't the one I remembered. And that was starting to make me think. Rachel's eyes were fixed on the table, but it was clear her mind was elsewhere. She was fighting a battle within herself, and for the first time I was seeing her this vulnerable. In the past, I would have reveled in this moment, seeing her lost, weak, and helpless. Thinking about everything she put me through as a kid, I'd feel she deserved it. But now, as I noticed the cracks in her, an unexpected feeling settled in my chest, unease. Rachel had always been a storm to me. And now it seemed like that storm had reached its end. "What do you want, Rachel?" I asked finally. She lifted her head, her eyes finding mine. She stayed silent for a few seconds, then shrugged faintly. "I don't know." "You don't know?" She sighed. "Mom and Dad keep trying to shield me from everything, Alex. They think sending money will save me. But she clasped her fingers together, her gaze suddenly hardening. "I just want to hear the truth for once." I narrowed my eyes. "What truth?" Rachel stared at me for a long time. Her face was uncertain, as if she were teetering on the edge of saying something she'd held inside for years. Then, in a very soft voice, she asked, "Do you think I'm really that bad of a person?" Every muscle in my body tensed. That was a question I should have been asking her. After all the years she tormented me, was she really expecting me to give her an answer now? But as I looked at Rachel, I didn't just see her as she was today. I saw a little girl, the one everyone looked at but no one truly saw. We'd grown up in the same house, but we'd played different roles. She was the storm, constantly demanding attention. I was the overlooked child, forced to hide in my own shadow. I didn't know how to answer her. So I was honest. "I don't know, Rachel," I said. "I haven't forgotten what you put me through. But I also don't know why they turned you into the person you became." Rachel frowned. "Turned me?" I nodded. "Yeah. Mom and Dad always put you at the center. But do you think that actually helped you?" Rachel looked away. Something was shifting. For the first time, I didn't feel hatred toward her. There was still resentment, yes. But the idea that she, too, might have been a victim in her own way was starting to shake something inside me. Rachel didn't speak for a while. Then, unexpectedly, she let out a laugh, but this time there was no mockery in it. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "We grew up in the same house, but we never really talked." I thought for a moment. "We're talking now." Rachel nodded. "Yeah. But this is a conversation that should have happened 18 years ago." She was right. But we couldn't change the past. All we could do now was keep it from swallowing us whole. Rachel took a deep breath and stood up from the chair. "I should go." I looked at her. "Do you regret coming here?" She paused for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No." She walked toward the door but stopped just before leaving. She glanced back at me over her shoulder. "You don't have to give me money, Alex. But if you ever want to talk, I'll be here." I wasn't ready to hear those words. But when Rachel stepped out the door, an echo of her lingered inside me. And for the first time, I thought that maybe my past didn't have to hold me captive forever. Rachel buried her head in her hands. Seeing her like this, it was strange. The Rachel who had dominated me, crushed me, ignored me for years was now sitting in front of me like a small child. Should I believe her? Or was this just another manipulation? I took a deep breath and sat down in the chair. Why are you telling me this, Rachel? She lifted her head, her eyes weary but still hiding something. Because, I don't know, Alex. I feel like Mom and Dad's approach isn't right. They've always fixed things for me, but this time, maybe they can't. Maybe I really messed up. Maybe I'm actually guilty. Hearing that from her shifted something inside me. Rachel was never guilty. Or at least not in her own eyes. She was always right. I was the one exaggerating, misunderstanding, or ignoring her fragile nature. What did you do, Rachel? Her gaze turned evasive. I was in charge of financial records at the company. I adjusted a few transactions because things had gone wrong. But people think it's fraud. She took a deep breath. I just lost control. Control. The thing Rachel valued most. So you might actually be guilty, I said, weighing my words carefully. She looked away but then nodded. Yes. Silence settled over us. For the first time, I was seeing Rachel like this. But why didn't it satisfy me? Seeing her crumble, watching the superiority she'd held over me for years collapse, it should have felt triumphant, right? It should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Because the look in Rachel's eyes, it was familiar. I remembered a time years ago when I'd felt something similar. Back in that house, crushed under the weight of being ignored, writhing in helplessness. I'd wanted to scream into their eyes, "Can you see me just once?" Now, Rachel was looking at me with that same expression. But I couldn't be expected to feel sorry for her, could I? Was I supposed to forget everything she'd done? I leaned back in the chair. So, what do you want from me, Rachel? She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she whispered, I don't know. And in that instant, I realized this visit wasn't really about money. Rachel was truly lost. Rachel clasped her hands together, as if trying to hold herself together. Do you believe me, Alex? Question echoed inside me. Did I believe her? Could I believe Rachel, the one who had manipulated me, worn me down, belittled me for years? I didn't know. But I did know one thing. She no longer had power over me. I had to make a decision. Would I pity her and save her? Or would I keep the line between us and move on with my own life? I swallowed. And for the first time, I made a decision that was truly mine. Rachel, I said quietly, what do you expect me to do? Her eyes locked onto mine. There was still a trace of that familiar manipulation in them, but also a fragility. Rachel was genuinely expecting something from me. But this time, I didn't want to carry her burden. I was no longer the little girl who lived in her shadow. I was Alexandra, and I wanted my life to truly belong to me for the first time. Rachel was waiting for my answer, and I knew what I was going to say. But before I said it, I took one last breath. Rachel's eyes were fixed on me. As always, she was expecting something. For me to save her. To brush aside her mistakes and say, like Mom and Dad had for years, it's okay, Rachel, we'll take care of it for you. But I wasn't going to do that. I refused to be the Alexandra who once lingered in her shadow, silently suffering. So I took a deep breath and leaned back in my chair. Rachel, I said, weighing each word carefully. You told me the truth. I appreciate that. But I'm not going to save you. Rachel's eyes widened. For the first time, I truly caught her off guard. What do you mean? I'm not giving you money. You're not going to find a way out of this through me. Your mistakes aren't my responsibility. Rachel let out a sharp breath, as if hearing this for the first time. But, no, I said, my voice firm. Mom and Dad always chose you, Rachel. They always pushed me aside. But this is my story now, and I'm choosing myself. A flicker passed across Rachel's face. She tried to say something, but couldn't. For once, she had no words. I recognized this silence. It was the silence of someone who had lost. I stood up slowly. "You can go now." Rachel's eyes clouded, but she didn't cry. That Rachel would never cry. But I could see the cracks in her gaze. "You've really changed," she said finally. I met her eyes without looking away. "Yes, I have. And I'm not going back to who I was." Rachel rose from her seat without another word. She adjusted her bag, gave me one last look. Then she headed for the door. And for the first time as I watched her leave, I didn't feel an emptiness inside. 'Cause I knew Rachel was returning to a world I was no longer a part of. She opened the door and walked out. And when she was gone, I felt a genuine peace within me for the first time in years. After the door closed, I stood still for a while. Rachel was gone. But there was a strange unease inside me. I'd won, hadn't I? For the first time, I'd held my boundaries, rejected Rachel's hold over me. I told her I wouldn't carry her burden. So why did I still feel a weight inside? I turned to the window. Sighed, everything was still alive. The city lights flickered, the streets teemed with people. Laughter rose from a cafe while a couple walked quietly at another corner. Life went on. I was going on too. But there was a shadow within me. Rachel's face flashed before my eyes, shocked, helpless. I didn't owe her anything. My years, my loneliness, my neglect, no one had ever made up for those. And yet, I started questioning myself. Was that fragility in her eyes real? Or was it just another game? I took a deep breath and returned to the kitchen table. My phone was still there. Mom and Dad's calls blinked on the screen. I pressed delete. But when I saw Rachel's number, my finger hesitated. Should I text her? No. This wasn't my problem. But inside, the scars left by my childhood traumas ached. I made a coffee and sat in the small chair by the window. I'd give myself time to think. I needed to figure out what this meant. For the first time, I had to think just for myself. But Rachel's return had cracked open doors inside me that had been closed for a long time. And once those doors were open, it was hard to ignore some things. The next morning, I opened my eyes when the alarm went off. I wanted to carry on with my daily routine. I got up, made my coffee, took a shower, and started getting ready for work. But there was an unease inside me. Rachel's arrival had triggered something. It had opened old notebooks I hadn't touched in years. And I felt that until those notebooks were closed, my past wouldn't fully stay behind me. Maybe that's why I was struggling to forgive her. 'Cause Rachel didn't just represent bad memories. She was a symbol of my family's neglect. She was a symbol of my invisibility. I glanced at my phone. My message inbox was empty. Rachel hadn't called. Was that good or bad? I didn't know. But there was an urge inside me. I wanted an answer. When she knocked on my door, she didn't even seem to know what she wanted. She didn't know what she expected from me. But that look on her face, I'd seen that look somewhere before. There had been days when I'd seen the same face in the mirror. I took a deep breath. And against my will, my fingers moved to the messaging screen. "What are you going to do, Rachel?" I stared at the screen for a while before sending it. This was her problem, not mine. But the past didn't always close so easily. And maybe before I could fully shut that notebook, I needed answers to some questions. I sent the message. I looked at the screen. And I waited for a reply. After sending the message, I set my phone on the table and took a deep breath. I didn't fully know what I was doing. I hadn't forgiven Rachel for what she'd done to me in the past. I didn't trust her, but it still felt like something inside me remained unresolved. The phone stayed silent for a long time. Maybe Rachel wouldn't reply. Maybe her knocking on my door and leaving was her closure too. I was ready to accept that. But just as I took a sip of my coffee, the screen vibrated. Rachel, I don't know, Alex. For the first time, I don't know what to do. As I stared at her words, something inside me clicked into place. Rachel had always seemed strong, always in control. But now she seemed lost too. Could I be sure she wasn't trying to use me? No. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I picked up the phone and wrote one final message. You have to figure this out on your own, Rachel. I've worked too hard to build my life. I can't save you. But if you want to change, maybe one day we can really talk. I sent it. I didn't wait for a reply. Because for the first time, it didn't matter what she did or didn't do. For the first time, I was truly free. That evening, when I returned from work, I felt light. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer dragged my shoulders down. I locked my door and looked out the window. The city was the same, but I wasn't. For so long, I'd carried the pain of being alone. I'd buried my family's neglect deep inside. I'd used the scars Rachel left on me to build myself up. And now, for the first time, when I looked back at the past, I realized I wasn't trapped there anymore. That house, those years, that pain, they were part of my story. But they no longer defined me. I sat at my kitchen table and cut myself a slice of cake. Candles had long been extinguished, but this celebration wasn't about a flame. It was a celebration of my life. As I sank my fork into the cake, I whispered to myself, "Happy birthday, Alexandra." And for the first time, those words left a genuine warmth inside me.